All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? This is Devin Culbertson from the Enterprise and Spark teams, and I just wanted to kind of kick us off here. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Okay, that's better. I want to thank everybody for joining and taking a little time today. Some of you had the pleasure of hearing some of Dr. T's work in LA and talking a little bit about sort of the importance of persuasive narratives in the work that we do. As the year went on last year, it became more and more clear that not only did Spark and the Spark communities have a story to tell about what was happening in our work and the change we wanted to see, but there was a real importance to be able to do that persuasively, not just passionately. And so, in LA, we got to spend some time hearing a little bit about the broad strokes of how to do that and how to win over the audience. And somebody mute if you're on a train or a loud place, please. And so beyond those broad strokes, one of the things that we had been working on. Okay, I think I've been unmuted here. Can folks hear me?
Hear you.
Maybe. Okay. So sorry about that. Beyond sort of the broad strokes of what we learned in LA about how to construct some of these persuasive narratives, really want to dig into displacement in particular and understand how people were thinking about this and how sites could work more closely with consultants or with some of these materials to really persuasively shape the local narratives around displacement and the solution set that they're recommending and trying to bring forward. So that's going to be sort of the focus of this webinar, as well as a written product that will follow. So before we dive into Tiffany's presentation, though, I did want to see Sasha up, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the work that Race Forward has been doing in tandem with this, that we hope can really have some strong synergy as we start to incorporate it this year.
Everybody, Sasha Forbes from NRDC. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, all right, good. So one of the companion pieces that we wanted to do alongside this webinar was making the case for racial equity. We've been working with Race Forward over the last year or so on the persuasive argument for, if you only have 5 minutes with public officials, what do you really say about racial equity in the context within your community? If you have 20 minutes, what do you say? So as you listen, or as we all listen to the presentation today, I think one of the things to keep in mind is there are a lot of things that that Tiffany has been able to show us around how do you really build narratives, how do you talk about race with local government, what are some strategies that work. So just keeping in mind that we have the lessons learned from the Making the Case for Systems Change, and then hopefully we can bring that forward into the webinar that we'll have with Race Forward on February 25th. And so I think that has already gone out to everyone, but we can share that information again. So again, we think about this as an alignment of work to make the case not only inclusive of race, gentrification, and displacement. And that will be February 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Tiffany, all you.
Excellent. All right, Tiffany, if you want to take it over, I think we can all see your screen and you can unmute and take it away. Folks, feel free to put questions in the chat box as we're going along, and then we'll open it up after the presentation.
Okay, great. And I'm still hearing quite a bit of feedback, so yeah, just to echo that. If there are folks who can mute, please do. Okay, so I'm going to jump in anyway. We're gonna fight through it. So I'm Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and I have, after spending many years with enterprise community partners, have gone off on my own to sort of create an organization called The Case Made, which is really focused very specifically on how do we build public will. Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, for some reason, I'm getting some weird feedback, but we're gonna fight through it and sort of figure that out. So, to put together an organization that really is helping folks build the public will around this issue of systems change, we have done a good job, I think, as social change advocates overall of helping people think about issues. But we've had a really difficult time, I would say, as a part of a field, getting people to wrap their heads around what it means to actually change systems, not just to try to think about issues. And so the organization is really sort of bringing forward all of the good social science and good community practices that we know are working across the country to build public will around a lot of issues. So I'm going to talk through, there are a couple of different resources that I'm either going to talk specifically from that I want to just make sure I highlight at the very top, so that if you haven't gotten these, you don't have to take copious notes off of the webinar today. Most of what I'm going to say is summarized in the piece that was attached to the invite, and then there's some other pieces that are really critical in terms of helping to understand this perspective around strategic case making, which how do we do that? We're trying to build equitable and inclusive systems change that comes from our work. So I'm going to go forward and say, just, I'm really going to start where all of us are, right, where you are, which is we all recognize that we have to be able to build a broader sense of support around the issues of equitable and inclusive development. It's never been more important. It's never been more difficult to do that. And we're going to talk in this webinar about not just why it's difficult, but also how do you get up and over some of the more challenging aspects of this work. So, in thinking about sort of where we are and diagnosing our challenge here, we all know that equitable and inclusive development is it's a systems problem. If we look at what's happening in terms of displacement and gentrification, both those issues are huge, and not because a developer in one community is developing in a way that does not include the residents of that community. It is a broader systems problem that is playing itself out all across the country. And it is also an adaptive leadership problem. That is to say that we are not getting in front of what we're seeing both as citizens, but also in terms of our public leadership. And so the challenge for us is to really help people to see this displacement as an issue that is a systems problem, and then also see that it's solvable, I would say, from the perspective of adaptive leadership. So having said that, that is not currently where we are. Somebody once said the single biggest sort of failure of leadership right now is that we continue to treat problems as if they're technical problems versus system and adaptive challenges. What does that mean? That means that we're working on things that are downstream as technical problems. How do we solve these sort of small things when the real issues are really broader systems and adaptive? So I want to give an example, what I call the backpack problem, which is in many communities across the country. In fact, in the employer, a recent employer of mine, right, has a drive that they do every year where they provide backpacks for at the beginning of the school year for kids, because a lot of the kids show up the first day of school without backpacks and all the things that are in backpacks, but no.
I'm on it. You can come in here.
The crayons, all the things that they need. And so the employers have figured out that that's a good way to have employees sort of lean into solving that as an issue. The challenge that I think most of us would be able to identify is, one, the irony of that is, especially having employers begin to sponsor it, is that a lot of the employees of those companies are the very employees who cannot afford to provide backpacks and school supplies for their children, despite the fact that that is a huge priority and value of those parents. And rather than having those employers say, right, to ask the adaptive leadership question, why are so many parents year after year not having enough resources to buy backpacks and school supplies for their kids? They organize the backpack drive, and then they ask their employees, many of whom, right, are themselves not earning very much. They ask those employees to chip in $15, $20, $30, whatever they can, to provide backpacks to the surrounding community. And so year after year, that problem gets larger and larger and larger. And from the public vantage point, even those employees who are providing every year a little bit, are saying, we've been asked every single year to provide more and more and more of these backpacks. Why aren't those parents, right, valuing education enough to provide backpacks for their children? And again, the larger question is, what we're after, right, what would actually solve that is having a living wage that pays people enough to be able to afford not just the backpacks, right, but also a whole range of issues: rent, mortgages, medical care, all the things that families actually need. And so what I'm going to say to us is going to be a theme of this webinar is the way in which we're messaging and communicating or making a case for our work means that we keep getting backpacks. And I want us to be able to say, and I hope you're with me on this, that the aspirations of folks who are on this call is bigger than backpacks. We don't want the backpack. We don't want the backpack. We're done with the backpacks, but we want the living wages that allow folks to be able to provide for their families. And I think when you think about displacement and you think about some of the issues the things that we have been able to win so far along those lines, a lot of it amounts to backpacks. And so when I'm going to talk on this call about how do you make a case for something that's bigger. So when those issues emerge, we're not talking about this as a technical problem. People don't have backpacks, let's give them backpacks. You're asking the question, why don't people have what they need? And how do we organize, right, our communities to make that happen? So a couple of things we're going to do on the call. Just first of all, we're going to talk about why building public will is so tough, right? Even among folks who would actually benefit from the work that we're doing around displacement and investment in communities. Why is that so tough to get people to lean in on some of the issues we're talking about? Then we're going to talk a little bit about why messaging and communications is only part of the problem. Some of us start to believe that if we could just get the right words, if we could just say it in the right way, we could get people to lean in, and that's often not the case. And so we're going to talk about why it's not just about messaging and communications. If you're not bringing more to the table, you're going to have a lovely conversation that gets you backpacks. And so we're going to talk about how to get up and over that. We're going to also talk a little bit about what's working and what's not in terms of how we advance this issue of equitable and inclusive development. And actually, I would say what's working was not just around this issue of displacement and changing the sort of narrative or conversation around that. From a lot of research that I've been doing around the country in various communities around this issue, looking both at campaign materials, when folks do campaigns, what are the kind of materials they're putting out, as well as what's showing up in the media around some of these issues. And then finally, we're going to talk about just a couple key recommendations that can help you to begin to make a stronger case for public support. So I'm going to start with a quote that I had in a paper that I did before, which is a long quote, I know, but I want to there are a couple things I want to pull out of this quote. So we all recognize that we certainly need broader public support for equitable and inclusive development. The challenge I think I want to focus on, at least initially in this conversation, is that our assumptions about why we're not getting that support has led us down a pathway that is not building public will. So we think it's that people don't care, it's that people aren't willing to put their time in, that they don't recognize these issues as important. And I can tell you that when I work with groups in every city of the country, I do focus groups on all kinds of things to think about, help people think about narrative and narrative issues. And what's really interesting to me is, you know, when I do those focus groups, and I mean, literally in every community across the country, and probably most of the cities, I think, that are Spark sites, I've done those kind of focus groups, bringing together, you know, average, ordinary folks, right, who are just trying to figure life out. And what's always interesting to me is how interested they are about the topic. They want to talk about it. I mean, I've had people literally follow me to my car because they want to keep the conversation going. And so our assumption that people are not interested, they're not engaged, when you sit down with folks, they want to have this conversation. But I think our assumptions about why they're not leaning in has led us to sort of communicate in ways, to talk, to engage folks in ways that are really not productive. And I will say one of the biggest issues, especially on displacement, and sort of gentrification and displacement kinds of issues, is that we like to use a lot of data to talk about, like, how many people are poor, how many people are displaced, right? Those kind of big numbers, because we think if people will lean in, and we like to give the history lesson. You know, there's so much more information about why communities historically have been the way that they are, right? We got Richard Rothstein and a whole lot of other folks talking about what has continually happened, especially to communities of color. We have that information, not just when I was younger, it used to be sort of the conspiracy theories about what those people were doing, but now we have actually real information, cited data, and about that scholars have brought to the table. And so it's so tangible. You want to take that information and say, see, this is the reason why we've got so many communities that for so long haven't had the investment that they need and deserve, it's not because people aren't willing to put their time in. It's because, right, we've had redlining and restrictive covenants and a series of things that have really kept these communities from getting what they need. While all that may be true, right, history lessons, as wonderful as they may be, appeal to the folks who already are converted. They are not helping us to dismantle those harmful policies and to redesign unjust systems in terms of building public support. So again, the interesting thing is that the way that we tend to think about what's wrong, or we're diagnosing the system, why aren't people leaning in, has led us down a pathway that's not always productive. So hopefully on the call, I can give you a few ideas and recommendations for some practices that you can add to your work that may be very helpful. So just a couple things about why building public support around these issues is tough. One is that we're talking to a lot of different communities. We're advocating for systems change, but we have to build political will and public will at the same time, and those are very different things. I'm going to talk about it from the vantage point of building public will today, but both things are important, and they require a different set of, I would say, practices and strategies. But it makes it more difficult because you're trying to manage this at multiple levels. In addition, it's clear to me that we are in a sort of highly politicized environment where you got the blues and the reds, the Democrats and Republicans, in a locked consistently in an ideological battle around any number of things, immigration, Social Security. I mean, it's just the number of things we seem to have deadlocked on and are unwilling to compromise on makes it difficult to bring up these issues that really, if you think about displacement, really cross ideological lines. It's not that Democrats are so much better at addressing displacement. You think about NIMBY concerns, the same folks who say that they support affordable housing in a community are the same folks who will also show up at a community meeting and shout you down when you say that you want to build affordable housing. So that the challenge for us is that makes it even tougher for us to address these issues. When you've got sort of ideological challenges, partisanship, and on both sides of the aisle, not a whole lot of movement happening on the fundamental issues that are shaping this concern. So again, tough. You've got, when I look at this is a picture of Boston and someone just looking at neighborhoods across the city and what it costs in these communities for a 2-bedroom, very, very tiny apartment. A part of the thing that challenges us, and you all know this, I'm sure, is that folks are making a lot of money off this, right? So folks are making a lot of money off of the quote unquote housing crisis, right, that we have right now. And so it's hard to sort of build public will to shift and change when there's so much profit that's happening as a result of the thing that is harming lots of folks, right? On the other hand, the challenges of concentrated poverty in particular areas, which is also displacement. When you've got neighborhoods that have, for a very long time, been sitting stagnant, that have received no investment, and folks who even are, even basic folks who are just trying to make a living can't live in these neighborhoods anymore because the infrastructure, right, just doesn't exist. The investment doesn't exist. Right, it's really hard to explain that to folks. And when people see, and here's the biggest point, we're going to talk about that in a second. When folks see a community like this and they see any level of investment happen in a community, when you complain about the fact that that investment means displacement, they look at you like, what are you talking about? Like, you would rather see this right, blighted community rather than see the community, gentrified, right, and all, right, the coffee shops and all that kind of stuff coming in. So they don't. So the backfire that often comes from this is from folks who say, listen, you all ought to be glad, right? You all ought to be, you all ought to see this as a blessing that anybody wants to come in and invest in your community. And that is not, right, I think, the way that for those of us who are trying to do this work, want our work to be seen and shared. So I will say to you, y'all know this, but I'm going to say it, gentrification is tough. Gentrification and displacement together, I think, are probably just a dominant narrative, perfect storm. You got coming together, just powerful, all of the worst, I think, sort of dominant narratives that are sort of operative in the public discourse coming together all at one time. You got this dominant narrative of individual responsibility. So when you say people aren't able to live in this community, they say, well, you have to take responsibility. I mean, like, if you can't live there, you got to find someplace else, right? You can't stay there. Or here's the one that comes up the most. Then if you all want that neighborhood and you want to be entitled to that space, you have to own it. So go get a job, work 2-3 jobs, whatever you need to do, and buy your home in that neighborhood, right? So that narrative of individual responsibility doesn't have any context around it, but it's easily, right, directed at us. So that is
Right.
huge. That narrative of mobility, that second narrative, is huge on issues of gentrification. So I'm going to say
Right.
to you all, when you say that people are being forced to move because they can't afford where they live, or they're being forced to move because there's absolutely no investment in the communities where they live, and there's no input, they can't live there anymore. People say, well, yeah, you have to move. Yeah, you do. And that narrative of mobility is not shocking to folks in the way that we, right, are talking about it. And then the final, I think
Right.
the big perfect storm is the narrative around racial difference. And I think, Brian Stevenson talks about this really profound. I just, I have a crush on Brian Stevenson, because I love the way he talks about these issues around the narrative of racial difference. We don't have a conversation about the issues around race. So when you talk about that there are racial implications or racial equity issues, if those issues are not framed well in your communications, they backfire, because people ascribe those differences to the fact that different groups of people are different, that those African Americans, they don't really value homeownership, or they don't do what they need, right? Whatever that is, right? They assume that those
Right.
differences are due to differences in terms of race, not
Right.
due to challenges in terms of systems that have
Right.
not worked well, or have actively
Right.
worked against the well-being of people of color. So you got really, I mean, on this issue, you
Absolutely.
got like a perfect storm like no other. And if you throw on top of that the fact that we are in the midst of a housing quote unquote crisis, right in the middle of that, this is tough. This is not, of all the issues I think within housing, I think this is really probably one of the biggest challenges. So it's also tough because when we don't, as I said before, sort of set this up right, it backfires. And not, again, the challenge for us is, especially on this issue of how people are talking, mostly when it shows up in the newspaper, it shows up as gentrification. It shows up in a way where not everybody is sad that gentrification is happening. As I said before on the other slide, a lot of folks are profiting off the fact that neighborhoods are
Right.
gentrifying, right? New high priced condos are going in. So not everybody is sad about the fact that people have to leave. And often when we try to lift up some of these issues about what's happening to people, it just backfires. And I won't go through that on this call. Sometimes when I talk to folks who don't understand these issues, I go through all the backfire quotes. People saying, gentrification. I mean, people have been moving around since the Dutch, like hundreds of years ago. What are y'all complaining about? This is what happens. People move into, right? Neighborhoods are dynamic. People change. Like this used to
Go
came
ahead.
in, and they worked hard, and then they had to move, and this used to be a neighborhood of these kind of, like, this is just the way, right, America functions. And if you all don't understand that, I don't know what to tell you. Like, people move around. Blacks move to the suburbs, whites move into the city. Why does this have to be, quote unquote, in this quote, represented as a problem, right? This has happened time and time again. There's a vibrant neighborhood, lots of economic activity, lots going on, rents go up, people have to move. It is life. This is the way America functions. And then somebody help me understand. Somebody would say, why the working class is being pushed out of their homes? Do they not own their own homes? Do they rent? Right? The issue is they don't understand. I love this. The importance, quote unquote, of private property.
Right.
Those people do not understand that they should be buying buying those neighborhoods, right? And then they wouldn't have this problem of being pushed out. And of course, for those of us on this call, we understand that even when lots of folks, particularly people of color, have bought into neighborhoods. People
Right.
don't know the history of urban renewal programs. They don't know the history of redlining, gentrification, and they don't know the Tulsa race riots where you had people invest in neighborhoods and communities and had the whole damn thing burned down, right, in a single day, right, because of a whole series of issues. So that conversation is lost when you sort of lift these issues up. So as I said, you got a perfect storm here. In the paper that linked in the site, I list specifically on gentrification displacement the narratives that are really specific to this conversation that come up consistently as pushback, and I try to differentiate that from the way that we think about these issues. So on the one hand, the way the public understands these issues, the narrative is displacement and segregation are natural outcomes of a functioning market-driven economy. So the notion of this is when you talk to people about displacement and even just segregation, they will say people want to live with other people like them. If you're high income, you want to live in a neighborhood with other high income people. You don't want to live with poor people, right? So So yeah, if I'm gonna invest and if I'm gonna buy a nice place in a nice community, I'm not buying in a community where there are lots of poor people. If I have a higher income, I want to, or I may not want that. African American people may want to live with other African American people. Latinos may want to live with other, right? So there is this conversation about segregation as being a natural part of a functioning economy, that people will naturally segregate themselves and sort themselves in various ways. And displacement is simply a function of that. When one group decides to move in, other folks sort of circle around them, and that's just the way things are. Versus the way that we tend to think about these issues as a function of intentional policies that have been organized, right, to sort people out. The second one is the threat of displacement is a motivator. People will say, well, if you want to be in a better community, you got to work hard. And that's a motivator, that when you you want to get to a better neighborhood, you want to get to it, but you want to be in a place where there's all these resources, a community of opportunity, you got to work hard. And that makes you work that second job and work that Uber job after work and do all the things. And if you just give that to people as right, what they would say as the reward, right, for their success, they don't have any motivation to work harder. So I would say that, right, again, the way that we tend to think about displacement is not the same way that you see playing out in the public discourse. Another one, any investment in communities is progress. So when you say, hey, some of these investments are really harmful to people who actually live there, they say, listen, this is progress. We are revitalizing neighborhoods. We have no time to be figuring out who's this, right? So that is seen as progress. And I'll say at the bottom one there, that anytime you criticize, right, what's happening in terms of displacement or that investment, people think of it as an affront. You don't want progress. You're coming out against prosperity or against wealth creation in those neighborhoods versus, right, what we would tend to say is we're trying to help, right, residents also be more stably housed and have an investment in this neighborhood. So I won't go through all of that. In the paper, I sort of lay that out a little bit more carefully, but I think those are the sort of narratives that are consistent when we try to lift up these issues of gentrification and displacement in a positive way. And they are consistent with the way some of the we put out a paper 2 years ago just around the things that backfire, that when you don't navigate carefully around those narratives, it just comes back to bite you. And here's the way that it bites you. When you see the backfire is consistent, whether you're in Chicago or Memphis or Detroit or Seattle. They may have slight differences around them, but the basic kind of conversation, the backfire that you get is relatively the same. So what I'm going to say to you all is just simply, listen, if you think that you're going to push back on that with your data and your charts and your figures, or if you think that you're going to rail against those narratives by just showing the story of somebody, a woman or a person or man who's been displaced from a community and the challenge that it faced, if that is what you're bringing to the table, then what's going to happen is the backfire effect consistently. That even when we try to bring our data, our facts, and our figures, if we don't carefully make a case for what could be in place of that, what actually happens is a backfire effect. So that was the sort of first piece. The second piece I'll say about that is I would say there's some bad news in that, and I would say this is not just a communications problem. Because again, as I said at the top of the webinar, people often assume that this is really just about the way we're talking. If we just change the way that we say this about racial equity, or we say this about, that it's not, right? And the way that, so a couple different ways I want to share that. In the news media, the way that these issues are showing up, especially issues of gentrification, which is usually the way it shows up, is that these concerns are framed as a sort of a dogfight, right? A big fight between powerful special interests, a fight between developers who want to make money, and a fight between community activists who are bringing, who are bringing the resources they have, right, to mobilize people against development in the neighborhoods. And so they're representing this as some kind of, right, big food fight between powerful interests. And the same thing around the public sector institutions are addressing this issue as if they are mediating, right? City councils and all, as if they're mediating these, right, the powerful interests between these two groups, as opposed to the fact that we know public sector institutions are themselves, right, creating a lot of the challenges that are happening in terms of what looks like a food fight between other folks, and not owning the responsibility of what it means, right? When you own public land, when you're responsible for how those public lands are managed, right? You are part of the problem, not simply the mediator for what's happening. And I could go into more of that, but again, this is not just the way that these issues are showing up in media overall is larger than just kind of the way that the conversation or the way that the words are. It's the way they're being framed, which is not very helpful. So a couple other periods of bad news. There's a great piece by David Brooks last year where he was talking about just the issue of why this is so hard. He was saying that he was trying to figure out to talk about why it was so hard to move racial progress forward. And he wanted to write this great article about how we were making so much progress, and he stopped himself because when he looked at the data, he just didn't see it. And he said, we have really settled into this reality that separate and equal is happening, and we really aren't too alarmed about that. And a part of what's driving that is what he said, a culture of individualism. People are focused on their little slice of the pie and not thinking about what are the broader implications for a community. And so I'm going to say that in terms of the issues around narrative and displacement and gentrification, if you are not building a bigger story, right, beyond people's own backyards, right, then it is incredibly hard to get folks to lean into the kinds of equitable and inclusive development that we're going to talk about on the call. So I'm actually going to skip this because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. And sometimes I talk too much and I won't get to the good stuff. So I want to make sure we actually get to the findings in the report. So I'm going to talk about that. So there are lots of things that I would say are bad news. The bad news I would say is that this is not just a communications problem. We're not just addressing issues as we're not using the right terminology. The good news on the other side of this is that there is some really good social science and good evidence-based practice from community practitioners on how to drive a different conversation that does have people lean in. So we know from Daniel Kahneman, who does sort of thinking fast and slow, where he talks about how you kick people into the slow brain. The fast brain is all that stuff that you get on comment sections and newspapers where people just say stuff, right? When you say people are being displaced from neighborhoods, what you usually get is this sort of fast brain, people just throwing out their reactions. You don't get the considered, thoughtful, let me think about what that means and how that, right? And so Daniel Kahneman talks a lot about how you kick people into the slow brain. A couple other of these are just really powerful pieces. Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath talk a lot about how you make ideas sticky. So when you say something, how do you make that information stick to people so that they begin to reason from, right, and make decisions from that information. And what we know a lot about information, for example, is that what makes information sticky is repetition. Hearing something over and over and over and over again is part of what makes it sticky. It's one of the things I would say Donald Trump does very well. He understands that every time he says something crazy, which is every other day, but anyway, says something crazy, every news media they all pick it up, and then no matter where you go, you keep hearing the same stuff over and again. He keeps repeating it over and over again. And what happens for our brains is that you start to store that information, and over time, it disconnects from where you actually heard it from. So you retain the information, but not the source of it. And that becomes like the way you think about issues, whether subconsciously, right? And so again, this idea of how do ideas become sticky, the repetition, like getting underneath that is really important. And a bunch of other things. I won't have time to go through this on the call, but I will say, let me just do one more, the scarcity. So the scarcity is important. And I said this, I think, when we were in LA, that a lot of our messaging is about just sort of throwing out data around what's happening in, right, scarcity. Oh my God, this many people are being displaced, or even listen to the story about this woman. She was in her home, right? And what I want to say to you is that we do that because we think that builds urgency around having people care about some of these issues and lean in. And what actually happens, we know this from a lot of good social science, is that the opposite happens. People actually lean out. That means they don't want to have the conversation because they become afraid, right? So when people think that they are operating from a scarcity mindset, they shut down. They start building walls, literally, around things to protect them, right, from other folks who might have access to them, versus they don't open up and say, oh, let us all share. Why can't we all just get, right? They close down. So here's the thing I want you to take away from this part of the webinar today, that a lot of the practices that we use, right, because we think they are gaining public support, they'll help us get people to lean in. They'll help people to see the crisis nature of it. They'll help people to see why this stuff is important. Actually backfire and has all kinds of unintended consequences that people actually either disengage, they don't want to hear what we have to say, or they walk away with very sort of negative perceptions of what we're trying to do. And so what I want you to be open to on the call, I won't have time to go through all of this, but to be open to the idea that there are a lot of what functions to actually move people forward happens in large part can be counterintuitive, right? And so we know a lot in social science that the answer to some of this is counterintuitive. So for example, if you want to sort of build urgency around issues, the way that you think you do that is to say, crisis, crisis, crisis. Look how many people have been displaced from their community in Denver and Chicago and Memphis. Oh my gosh, or look how many people, look at these neighborhoods. And you think that you yell that it would allow people to lean in, and the opposite happens. So the antidote to that is actually taking a more measured sort of tone in the way that you talk to folks around some of these issues. A whole range of things. Sometimes you think the way to get people to embrace issues of racial equity or to embrace issues, just, displacement overall, is to start a conversation talking about displacement. And what we know from a lot of good social science is that is wrong, right? Simon Sinek talks a lot about this in his book, Start With Why, right? Our brains are literally connected to why. It's the aspiration that people have that people connect to. And if you can connect their aspiration to the work that you're doing, that's how you get people to lean in. So I just want you to be open, especially as you look at some of the recommendations that come out of this work, that the way that you normally, the way that that's counterintuitive, that you right, that it may not be, if I want people to think about racial equity, I have to talk about racial equity. It means that you got to think about the order of that presentation so that people actually get it. It may mean you start with something that they actually want and then connect it to the issues of racial equity, which I think is actually more powerful. So, so what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about sort of the recommendations that come out of the work by really talking about, again, what Desmond Tutu said very clearly. Listen, don't raise your voice. Improve the way that you're engaging folks. Improve your argument, and you'll get people to lean in. And so that's really what this is about. So I will say, when I think about the work that I do around strategic case making, there's sort of three components in this that you are trying to manage as part of building a bigger case. One part is the way that you say it. That is the framing and communications part of it. You want to talk about this in a way that doesn't immediately backfire. So if you're trying to address issues of housing and you start talking about affordable housing, because that as a terminology is so negatively perceived in a public discourse, right, you don't want to start talking about affordable housing. That's not the way that you would actually say it. We talk a lot about, in some of the resources that I shared with you, the reports and the research, right, that talking about people having a decent place to live, right, people having a home, right, because that doesn't have the same negative connotations as affordable housing. So all that to say, there's one part of effective case making that's really about being very thoughtful about what you're saying and how you say it that matters. A second part of this conversation is talking about the power of storytelling, that even if you've got a thoughtful sort of communication just around, right, avoiding the backfire, if you don't embed in that sort of the power of storytelling, right, the powerful way that you're bringing these issues to the public, you don't have a way to engage people's sense of empathy. And more importantly, and I want to say this very carefully, it's not just about storytelling, but it's telling stories that direct people towards systems change, and that's really important. We're telling, and I want to say this carefully, because on the displacement narratives that I see, we are telling a lot of stories about what's happening to people, which is important. A part of the challenge is they're not leaning toward, those stories are not leading to having people queue up issues of why systems need to be changed. When I look at those stories, I say, wow, that person, he needs to change his life. And if you look at the comment section, when people were reacting to those stories, it's consistent about, directing people toward having sort of blaming people for their own circumstances. And I always say in this work, be careful that you aren't setting people up for judgment by other people, right, who will judge them because they are being displaced, because they don't own, right, property in the neighborhood, because they don't own the local stores, they don't have, right, a stake in that way. The final thing I think in this part is I call this, so this is avoiding the backpack problem, which is so if you've done the communications well and you've queued this up right, you've done the storytelling that really has people direct people to systems change. If you also are not building a case for support for a particular course of action, right, the value proposition of a particular course of action, you miss the boat. And what happens is you set all that up and you get a backpack. The value proposition and the call to action is so important. That's the sort of that's the fait accompli. Like that's the piece that actually gets you the bigger systems change. What is it that you're trying to do? Is it a program that's going to support or make sure that minority business owners or homeowners have X, whatever that is? Building a case around that specific value proposition. That means what's the revenue model that's going to support it? That means what's the return on the investment that's coming? That means understanding what's the social return. And yes, that means very specific data, right, that you're sharing with folks. It means talking about both the consequences of an action, but also talking specifically about the urgency of now. Like, why do we need to do this particular program or this particular thing now? With all the problems that are happening in the world, what's on the strategic horizon that makes this moment the moment we should be addressing equitable and inclusive development? We got all these problems. We got Social Security, we got immigration, we got opioid addictions happening. We got all kinds of things going. Why is this thing that you all are working on the priority that policymakers, that communities need to be leaning into, and the specifics of that? And I will say just on this part that I am a data wonk through and through, and I will tell you that this is the age of data. I say the same thing I'll say to you all that I tell to major sort of social impact investors and banks, that it is no longer acceptable for you to say you made an investment in a community and you don't know what happened. You don't know what happened to the people who live there. You don't know if they got health there. You don't know if they got more stably housed. There's too much data available for us not to be very clear about what the impacts of our investments are. And that includes folks on the call. You got to be able to share that. Like if you want folks to make an investment in your work, what's the likely social returns that's coming out of this? There's too much information and evidence for us not to have that. So what I will say to you is case making is the alignment of those things, the framing and the communications, the power of storytelling that directs people towards systems change. And the fait accompli is the bottom of that, which is making sure that you actually make a case for a particular course of action. And that's why this particular policy, legislation, ordinance, whatever it is, this is the thing we need to lean into. And here are the numbers that support it. Here's why it's urgent. Here's the consequences if we don't do it, right? Here's the social return on the investment. Here's why our cross-sector table, right, is the one to begin to lead us to that, through that issue. So, So I think I'm gonna go for maybe two more minutes. I want to make sure we have at least some time for calls. All of the rest of this is actually really the sort of the sort of specifics of what I want to talk about on the call. But all of the remainder of what's here is also in that first paper. So I talked a lot about what's working in the field. So when I looked at across 22 cities where there are active displacement campaigns moving, the things that are going well is we are showing in those campaigns great stories about people who are experiencing displacement. We're talking a lot about displacement as both unfair and unjust, so making very clear about what the value statement is around that. We are centering equity as part of those conversations, saying, hey, this is not just about making some tweaks to the housing system. This is about correcting some things that historically have been out of place in terms of equity for folks who need, right, some assistance and some help. And then also, I think it has been some of highlighting what I call sort of consequences of inaction, right? I see in a lot of your communications in the fields, a lot of talk about if you don't address these issues of racial equity, for example, then we're going to continue to have a system of disadvantage that is exacerbated by these issues. So when I look across the field of messaging and displacement, those things seem to be working well for us. Now, some of those things backfire, and I actually won't go through this because I think we have enough of the conversation about backfire. What I want to talk more about are the do's and don'ts that are the recommendations in that paper. And again, here's what I want you to do. I want you to put your hat on again of thinking about counterintuitive, that some of the suggestions and recommendations may sound counterintuitive, but they're based on that social science that when you when you think you're moving people to the left, if you're not careful, they can be going to the right, and unless you understand kind of why that's happening, it works against you. So on the do side of the category, you want to make the story big enough that this is a shared public concern by talking about the opportunity for wide-scale success. When we address displacement as an issue, there's a huge opportunity, and I think the Race Forward folks are going to talk about this next week, that when you lean into equity as a core value, that's a large enough, big enough concern that there's an opportunity for bigger success because we are thinking specifically about the equity issues that we haven't in the past. Diversify, number 2 on here, diversify, like who's actually benefiting from having equitable and inclusive development. And so I want you to think outside the box. Traditionally, when we talk about these issues of displacement, and who gets the benefits of this, we talk about a family or those families or some families, right? Or it may be even some small businesses that are able to stay put in communities because we have policies that are addressing their issues. But we don't talk about the wider region and the way the folks across the region, even people who are not even living in that neighborhood or community, actually benefit from having that community be stable and thoughtful. So hopefully, I think in the last conversation we were in LA, I talked a lot about leading with a strong narrative of interdependence. And you want to do that because you want to counter that conversation, which is all about segregation as being natural. It's not, right? The narrative around interdependence, that we are all across the region, neighborhoods and communities, regions rise and fall together. You don't have regions that are really deeply in poverty and debt and other regions doing well, and other parts of the region doing well, and have that region sort of rise together. And a lot of what's happening in the cities in which you're in is that the region is struggling because you've got such diversity across these different communities. So you want to lead with the way that we are all connected. Like what's happening in this community actually matters to the community right next door and the community next door to that, and so on and so forth. So do center equity. And here's the thing. Equity is best centered in the conversation as a metric of success. So when somebody says, Denver, we're doing really well in terms of, these 5 measures, the number 1 metric should be issues of equity, right? When you are addressing those equity issues, that's how you know you're building sort of broader prosperity across the region. That's the metric of success, not the metric of disadvantage. And that's important because if you don't do that well, what happens is that issues around equity get framed as problems. And so that becomes, especially, you problematize issues for people of color. Whenever people think about people of color, they think of those folks as problems. And that's not the connection you want to think about. Think about addressing the issues for people of color or economic inequality as the way that we actually get to a more thoughtful and constructive region. Navigate away from those dominant narratives. Don't do it. Don't talk about, and this actually, I'm gonna kick it to the don't section. I know that it feels like if you want to talk about displacement, the thing to do is to focus on people moving. But I am telling you that if that leads your communications, this many people have been displaced and they have to move, it backfires on you, because that is the narrative of mobility is dominant. People embrace that. They say, yeah, you got to move. So you say that as a problem. They say, yeah, that's exactly right. You got to move. This is not a place that you can afford. I'm sorry that that's happened. It's really sad. But they also launch into a whole series of things about, yeah, my grandfather, they used to live there and then they couldn't, and they had to move, right? And so, yeah, these other folks who are now communities that they now cannot afford, or communities where there hasn't been a kind of investment, they may have to move. So so I would say, here's the way I would say balance those issues in your messaging. Otherwise you get that sort of backfire. I would say don't make the case against gentrification and displacement. Make the case for equitable and inclusive development. So talk about the benefits, a wide scale opportunity for not just a better, more inclusive, more thoughtful community, but for the benefits that everybody enjoys when that happens. Businesses get more profitable. A community gets healthier. The hospitals, make all the benefits that you can possibly think of that are for, this issue of equitable and inclusive development. I will say again, don't give a history lesson or fact sheets as a call to action. There's nothing wrong with having folks understand the history of what's happened in particular places and communities. But if you think that that in of itself is a call to action, then you are going back into this sort of backfire again, where people will put that totally out of context, right? And they don't see the value of that in the context of what you're talking about. I will say don't shy away from the conversation about race, but be thoughtful about how you're having that conversation. Take the time, right, to introduce that thoughtfully into the communications. And I'm happy to even, and maybe the Race Forward folks will talk about this even more on their call next week. But from my vantage point, what the social science tells us is it's the order in which that happens in the conversation, not the conversation itself. So people are willing to have that conversation when they see their stake in resolving what are racial disparities. And that's that next slide. Like, don't have this conversation about racial disparities outside of systems and outside of solutions. People will have that conversation and they will go to the mat on these issues when they see their stake in it. So your job is, before you give all the statistics about how people of color or folks who are low-income folks don't have what they need or being displaced, right? Position first why this is important for all of us. And then when they see they stake in it, then you can go to town. You can give them you can give them the history lesson. You can give them the facts and figures. You can give them all of that. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say that the challenge for us and the opportunity is that if we want to really be able to do this, all this work that we're trying to do, developing inclusive and thoughtful and equitable communities or development in our communities is only possible to the extent that we get other folks falling in line. When they see this as not just a worthy goal, right? When they see kind of building systems that work in this way, when they see this as our responsibility, not just the responsibility of those who are on the backside or on the downside of development. So I'm going to stop there and I say, the part of my practice is doing a lot of work with organizations. I do a lot of materials reviews. So when you send me materials, go through that and say, oh, wait a minute, this is going to backfire. Here's a better way to say this, or here's a way to reposition this. Or if you do this out of order or sequence or first or second one, you'll get a better reception, right, if you move this around. And obviously I do lots of trainings and workshops, do a lot of campaign advising. Folks are putting together campaigns around displacement and development. Equitable and inclusive development, and then certainly communities of practice. So I'm going to stop there, and I will say that there are resources. I'm going to go back. I don't go there. That there are resources available that I shared at the very beginning. That because I raced through this really quickly, but there are lots of resources that you can go to get more of this information. So I'm going to stop and us open it up for questions. And I'm actually going to go back to that first slide with where the resources are, so folks can see those. Can we open up the lines and hear if there are questions?
Yeah, I think at this point, folks just need to individually unmute themselves to ask questions. We didn't have everything come through in the chat box. And while folks are doing that, I might ask a quick one myself, and that's just the 3 steps of case making that you had there in one of those slides. Is that something that you see as scalable, not just at the campaign level, but things that should be in an individual article and a social media post? That those 3 pieces should always be in the content, or do you see them weaving together more loosely?
That's a great question. I think this relates to what Sasha was saying on the beginning of the call. When you've only got 2 minutes, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to frame it well for broader conversation, tell the story, and then get all the way down into the numbers. So I would say that those are sort of progressive. When you've only got 2 minutes, you got to make the strong case in 2 minutes around just the framing of this issue. Why this is important to you, why you can trust me on this issue, why there's belonging, why you are critical to this effort, and why you have a stake in it. That's the beginning of the framing process. That's a shorter version. If you've got a little bit more space, then you want to build in more of that sort of, yep, come along with me. Let me tell you the story, not just of this one individual person, but about systems that have not worked well to advance the outcomes for a whole lot of folks, right, who need backpacks, right? Has not worked well for a lot of folks who need backpacks. And you want to sort of do that. And then if you've got, and at that point, if you've got even more time, and especially when you get down to the nitty gritty, when people lean in and they want to know, okay, how do we do this? I'm in. You framed it well. Yep. You got my heart engaged. I understand why systems are part of this, why I need more than a backpack. I need to think about living wages, or I need to think about the electoral college, or whatever that is, or I need to think about how we do development in this community. Now you have to actually make the case, and that strong value proposition exists. So it's a little bit of an iterative process for each one of those.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So others on the phones, please jump in.
This is Justin Merrick. I'm with Center for Transforming Communities in Memphis, Tennessee. And I honestly don't have a specific question. I just want to say that I'm a fan of your work, and it's really awesome to listen and absorb all of the things that you're saying. I came in about halfway through and was introduced to you out at the LA conference, and really just looking for, I think, that initial page where we can look up stuff and then, if possible, do immediate follow-up with you this week. Is that the page that you just showed us? The strategic case making, are those the resources that you were identifying for us to look at?
Absolutely, absolutely,
Okay.
and I'm happy even to follow up with questions even after. That's one of the reasons I shared the sort of materials with you, because I know this is a lot of things to absorb at once. And one of the things I can do when I sort of look at your materials, I can say, no, okay, let's talk about the framing first. Let's do framing, because that's probably that's the low hanging fruit, right? Let's figure out how to sort of get what you need in here to help people lean in. Then let's figure out. So what I'll say about that is, yes, as a matter of, the first step is probably to look at the resources, and then second step, I think there's some opportunity for some one-on-one back and forth to some of the sites to go through some of this in very real time, in a very specific way, given what you're actually trying to do. So thank you, Justin. I so appreciate it.
Yep. And to give you context, what we are practicing here is ethical storytelling. So it's like right in alignment. So I just want to bone up on what you're offering, and then have some more specific conversation. And
Perfect.
We have one question from the phone from Sasha, which was, how can we balance the interdependence of we are all in this together with the reality of the racial inequities and spatial justices that impact Black and Brown communities the most? She says, I'm sitting with being honest and leading with our values versus seeming pacifying. I've seen many instances where we start with, we are all in this, and then when we talk about this, and then when we go back about disparities, we go back to square one. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so great question. And I think that's a hard one for us in this movement. It is really tough. And I see this all the time when something happens and people will say, this is not who we are. This is something, and people will say, yes, we are. That's exactly who we are. I'm going to tell you, right? And you can do that, but what I'll say is that you're not going to get folks to be able to lean into it. A part of what we know from a lot of good social science about having people lean in is you got to build in the sort of we and the why at the top of this communication. Why should people lean into this? And if you don't tell them that they have a role in it, and you don't tell them what that role is, which is why the interdependence is important, they don't lean in. They don't see their role in this. So when they look at the fact that there are folks who are displaced and they say, yep, there are folks who've been displaced and they don't have a way to stay in their communities, I'm so sad about that. Well, go talk to them and tell them that, because I don't know what my role is in that. I don't see that. So that's the first issue. You got to bring people into the conversation in a way that helps them see their stake in it. And quite frankly, I say this all the time, if people don't see themselves in your storytelling, if people don't see themselves part of the conversation, they don't come to your party, and they won't come if you tell them from the very top of the conversation that you are the villain, you are bad, and this is right. But there is a way to have that conversation. Tell them why we all benefit when we solve this issue, and then you tell them how we got here, right, in a thoughtful way. So it's not just that we got to all this inequity because people didn't want to own their communities. Here's how we got here, but getting out of this is what makes all of us successful. So I have a whole longer conversation that I want to share, but I want to make sure we get a couple more people into the conversation. But that is really, at that framing piece, that is the core to the conversation. If you don't bring people in the conversation right, they don't see why they belong to it. They don't see why this is a conversation they need to be in, and they're waiting for you to give them the opportunity and the excuse to exit out. And so when you start a conversation in a place that doesn't include them, or includes them in a way that's they're out of that conversation so fast, you will not get them back in it. And so that's often a challenge for us. I know. I tell people all the time, it's hard for us, but you gotta fall out of love with your own language. You gotta fall out of love with your own kind of, I understand your own perspective. You gotta fall out of love with the way that you might have shared that in the past. The perspective is going to be shared. You need to talk to folks about redlining, about urban renewal, about Tulsa riots, right? But the way you bring them into that conversation is so critical. Otherwise, they will just check out before you even have a chance to really engage them thoughtfully. And thanks for that question, Sasha. That's great.
Hello?
Maybe one last one.
Hello. This is Will Whitehurst from the Atlanta Committee for Progress. Just first want to say thank you so much for your time in this discussion. This has been really interesting and very helpful. I guess just the question I had is, are there good examples of the equitable development that we've been talking about that we could point people to when they ask about kind of what the model would look like, either in other cities or successful case examples? And the reason I ask is, as I've started having conversations with people around this and advocating for it, I think a lot of people struggle to understand how, for example, affordable housing could be built into the, luxury apartment complexes that we're seeing in a lot of this gentrification. So I have found that, if being able to share an anecdote or an article about successful equitable development would be really helpful in kind of painting that picture for them.
So you are absolutely right. And I would say, as I talked about that last piece, that value proposition piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is core to that, because there's so much cynicism, just generally speaking, about our ability to really change systems. That is really key. But I also say, specific to this issue around displacement, when you talk to average everyday folks about issues of displacement, they don't believe, quite frankly, that development can happen without displacing people. They're like, no, you're not going to do it, because as soon as you bring these folks in here, right, as soon as you start to do that, what's going to happen is all these other developers, and in fact, in a couple, I was out in LA, and one of the, I'm working with some of our communities out there, and one of the challenge, they are struggling. They can't build affordable housing in higher income neighborhoods because of NIMBY, but now they're even having trouble building affordable housing in low and moderate income neighborhoods because people are afraid of gentrification displacement. They don't want it, because they say, you all going to come with that affordable housing, and the next thing you know, we're going to have a fancy coffee shop on the corner, and the next thing you know, so no, we don't even want it, right? So it's just this interesting quandary. They don't believe that you could actually have an investment in a neighborhood that revitalizes it without displacing folks who are low income or even poor. They don't believe that can happen. So to your point, Will, that it is absolutely critical as part of your case making that you give examples. And I think, there are a lot of good examples, but they're small. They're like in this small neighborhood in Seattle, in this small neighborhood in Denver, in this small little neighborhood in Brooklyn, where you begin to see sort of mixed income, mixed development, mixed race and ethnicity, sort of development, sort of communities happening. But plucking that is really key and important. It's essential to get people up and over the fact that they don't think that it's possible. It is possible, and it's happening. And let me give you a couple examples of how and why this is happening across the country. So absolutely, and I'm happy to share the ones that I know of. And I think there are a couple of displacement projects across the country that are specifically trying to lift up those examples, right, for exactly this reason.
Good afternoon.
So at this point, we're over time here, and I want to respect folks' time and wind this up. We can keep the line open, Tiffany, if you're able to stay on for a bit.
I can stay on for a couple minutes.
Just want to say, I know that we're having some technical difficulties, both with people getting on the call and off of mute. We actually maxed out at 100 participants, and some folks weren't able to get on. So I want to say that if there are other things that you that folks want to hear or have a national spark discussion with Tiffany about, we're happy to do more of these webinars and narrow in the topical focus a little bit. And as she mentioned, Tiffany's available to help with really, really granular support on specific messaging stuff. So with that, I'll kind of end things formally, but we can definitely leave the line open for a few more minutes if there are a few unanswered questions. So thanks everybody for attending.
Good afternoon.
Hey.
I'm Alexis Sturgis from Atlanta, representing the Sturgis Group. We are a small startup that has formed to address the specific gentrification and displacement of residents in the city of Atlanta. I attend a lot of meetings within this cross sector, and one of the points that I constantly bring up is the wage disparity gap and how that relates to the displacement of residents and the broadening gentrification housing crisis that we are currently experiencing. My question is, how do we find solutions for the systematic issues that have led us to this point without being very direct and honest about what the causes are and the reason that the problem continues to broaden from one coast to the other.
So love that question. So I would say that you do need to be very direct and honest about that. I would say it doesn't suit anybody not to have an authentic conversation about what the challenges are. I think if you don't, not only do you end up getting backpacks, but then you get mad at the fact that you really didn't have the conversation you wanted to have, and you got a backpack, versus right having a company or corporate a firm address the issues of the low wages that they're sharing. So that is definitely a part of it. You have to be honest. The challenge for us is understanding the implications of how you get people to lean forward in that conversation. So even just that, I mean, right. So thinking about the wage disparity gap and how you get people, if you frame it like that, they're not coming to that party. But there's a way to sort of open up that conversation first about who we are in common, that is the interdependence. We all have a stake in making sure that people who live and work in this neighborhood have a chance to enjoy the community around us. I mean, however you want to say that, but having people lean into that aspiration of themselves first is what you're trying to do. At the risk of going on and drawing on too long and probably giving an example that will take us a little bit off topic, I want to do it because I think it will highlight what I'm trying to say and maybe even address the question that Sasha asked earlier. So my son, who is 11, is 10 actually, about to turn 11, he comes to me one day and he says, "Mommy, I cleaned my room today, and I washed the dishes today, and I helped Dad clean up the garage, and I did my homework, and I got a proud out loud at school this week, and so I'm going skating, and can you give me $10 for snacks at the skating rink?" Right? And so here's what I want to say about that. If he had just come up to me and said, "Mommy, I'm going skating, I need $10, I'm about to buy some snacks, some chips, and some whatever," I would say, "Boy, go on with yourself. No, I'm not, no." But what he did was, like from the mouths of babes, right? What he did was engage me at the level of who I want to be, right? Who I want to be is a good mom. And so without saying that, I know you want to be a good mom, right? Let me tell you that you are. He told me all the examples of how I am. He said, "Mom, listen, I clean my room." All those are things that say to me, I'm being the person I want to be. And so he engaged me at the level of my identity, who I want to be, right? And how do you not give $10 to a kid who says that? I'm just saying, right? So as we're thinking about framing and messaging and communications, you are first, before you get to the ask, before you get to the hard stuff about, racial disparity and redlining and all the stuff that's going to be hard in this conversation. We are going to have an honest conversation. We're about to have it. Before we get there, right? Let's get all on the same page, and let me engage you in the identity, the person you want to be. And when people engage in that conversation, that conversation comes out in a very different way. So that's all that we're saying, is that, when I work with groups, the first question I ask them is, let's talk about, if you're Memphis, or who does Memphis want to be? The people who live here. What's the aspiration of the people who live here? And I'm listening for the kind of conversation there. If I'm in, Chicago, I'm listening for the aspiration of what people in Chicago are talking about. What are they trying to be? What do they want? That has to come first. Once you do that, then you set yourself up to have the hard conversation, the asks around particular policies, around how we address, wage disparities, and that's the hard stuff. But you got to set it up first well. Otherwise, people don't lean into that conversation. They go, "Oh Lord, here we go. She's going to come in here talking about how I'm to blame for all of their problems," right? So great question. Be very direct and honest, but set it up well so you actually get the result that you want. Not the backpack, but the policies around wage disparities and that gap.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
If no one else has a question, I'd like to know how we can address the term NIMBY, which seems to be a very pretty, glittery, nice word for classism. I think that the specific term NIMBY, while it makes people feel comfortable, I think it kind of glosses over the underlying root of a considerable portion of the problem that contributes to the housing crisis, which is classism. Is there a way to directly address classism without using the word NIMBY, but also without putting or off-putting people's emotional contribution to the conversation at large?
Yeah, so I'm hoping that you are, especially if this is a communication that's going to, like, where you're trying to lift up broader public support. I'm hoping that you're never using NIMBY. I'm hoping that you're never using class, and I would say it's bigger than just classism. I would say you got classism, you got racism, you got all kind of isms that are bundled up together, and also you got people who probably otherwise would be open to development, but they are afraid. So one of the slides that I skipped over was just talking about the enormous amount of economic anxiety there is right now among middle class people. Right? You got.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me now. Okay. So they unmuted me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to finish the question. So you've got so you've got a large amount of just economic anxiety, even people who probably be with us, but for the fact that they are staring at a set of circumstances, their own fortunes that are challenged. They've got a kid, their own kids that are surfing their couch with $200,000 in student loan debt. They got parents that they have to figure out how to take care of who cannot age in place, who are getting of coming of age where they have to figure out a different way to pay for their care. They don't have a way to retire. I mean, a whole series of issues. And so to the point about the David Brooks article that I shared, their lens on what's happening has shrunken. So they are very much concerned about, oh hell, how the hell do I just make sure my mortgage is paid, right? That I make sure that my kid has a decent future. So that lens is so narrow and so tight, right? Richard Reeves talks about this as dream hoarding. That lens is so narrow that they're not thinking about a community across town where people are not only just concerned about how to pay their mortgage, but they're actually getting actively, right, removed from communities, or in a community that is so dysfunctional because it hasn't received investment in decades, right, that people can't even live there. So what I would say to you is, I hope that's not the way I would, you're not engaging them ever in NIMBY, you're not engaging them in classism. You are addressing who it is that they want to be, and all of us want a decent place to live in a community that's thriving, right? And so you're engaging people at the level of who they want to be, right? And then talking about why they have a stake in that community all the way across town, right? Where people look very different from them, right? Why they have a stake in the success of quote unquote those folks, right? When I talk about this in longer sessions, I talk about case making as about social proximity. When people can create layers and layers of distance, and they can project those people, you've lost, right, the conversation. Case making at its core is about bringing that issue so close to people that they can't sort of make that statement. They can't distinguish between their own fate and their own interest from the interest of the folks that y'all are trying to rock for. And the way that you do that is being very strategic in what you're talking about and how you set up that conversation. So I'm gonna stop there, but that's a yeah. No NIMBY, no classism. We're gonna bring that. Bring you in a conversation a very different way to help you sort of lean into this conversation is what I would say you were trying to get people to do.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Other folks?
No. I think that might be it. I know there's P-Moses was trying to get in here. I'm not sure if she's still on or off mute at this point.
That's okay. I would say for those of you who may have questions, beyond this, my email address is on the materials, but it's DRT@thecasemaking.com, and I'm happy to answer questions that are beyond the context of the webinar, because I know that there is a lot of information here, and I want people to be able to absorb it in the work because it matters. As I said when we were in LA, I feel like this is a huge opportunity for us. We don't get this kind of opportunity very often. You know, we have this perfect storm that has emerged for a very particular, not for a particular reason, but it's emerged, and we ought to take advantage of it. I will say that, you know, we, as I, you know, shared when I was in LA, I shared, you know, we went in 2008 when the housing market, quote unquote, crashed. We lost the narrative. The narrative was all around big banks, too big to fail, Lehman Brothers, blah blah blah. It wasn't about what's happening in our communities, and it wasn't about having a home and what that means, and who's losing their homes and why that's happening. We lost the opportunity to build a bigger coalition and a conversation in the public discourse around what it actually means to live in a place and have it and be entitled to what that place has to offer. And I think, you know, for better or for worse, here we are again, less than a decade later, and we are in the same place where there is a national conversation happening about communities and housing, where and not just housing, but just the health and well-being of our neighborhoods and communities. And it's happening very quickly. And if we don't all right, change course to some extent, we're going to lose this opportunity again. So anyway, all that to say, I'm happy to engage people even beyond the webinar because I think this is important. I want us to really live into the power of the moment, and to do that, we need to have strong strategic case making.
Well, thanks so much, everybody. Do send emails to Tiffany or to the Spark staff site coordinators. We're actively thinking about how to kind of build on this conversation and keep this case making thread alive, ideally with some stuff that's more interactive and less just presentation structure. So thanks everybody for joining, and have a good afternoon / evening wherever you are.